Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter. Welcome to the Daily Check-In for June 10th, 2020. Today's topic is going to be, is Kubernetes too complex? That's an interesting thought. And I definitely have some opinions on that, so I'll get to that in a few moments. Before I get into that, a couple quick housekeeping items. First of all, I had a fantastic conversation with Bobby Allen all about multi-cloud and hybrid cloud and a bunch of other stuff on the Day 2 Cloud podcast. It's a podcast that I host with Ethan Banks, and the conversation was awesome. It just got published today, so if you don't already subscribe, this would be a great episode just to try out the podcast and see what we're all about. I really enjoyed the conversation, so I can't recommend that enough. I'll include a link in the show notes. Second thing is my subscriber numbers are going up, and I appreciate that, everybody. If you don't mind just, hitting that subscribe button, or even better, hitting the share button and just sharing it on your social media feed, I really appreciate that. It gets more viewers in front of the ideas that I try to get out there, and I don't make any money off this. It's really just about disseminating information. So this is driven by you, the community. If there's something you want me to talk about, let me know. I'm happy to talk about it. I've got a list of ideas, but I'm happy to add new ideas to that list. And your ideas get priority over the stuff that I have in my backlog. So with that out of the way, I just want to check in with you. How you doing? It's Wednesday. I like Wednesdays. Wednesdays are, well, they're not Tuesdays, because Tuesdays are Terraform Tuesdays and Taco Tuesdays sometimes. But Wednesdays are pretty good because you can, the end is in sight. You can see the end and you're moving towards it. Tomorrow will be Thursdays on the edge. That's always fun too. That's really all I got, though. I hope you're doing well. Let's talk about Kubernetes. Everybody loves talking about Kubernetes. All right, so my question was, is Kubernetes too complex? And I think first we have to examine what we mean when we're talking about complexity, because there are various levels of complexity. Probably the first time you encountered complexity was at some point when you're taking science class. They talked about simple versus complex machines. And a simple machine could be something like an inclined plane or a lever. Those are simple machines. And from those base constructs, you can create more complex machines. And that's essentially what we've done through the computing revolution. Is we've taken relatively simple concepts, binary, for instance, on off. We've taken that. We've taken the transistor, which is a relatively simple concept, and we have combined multiple transistors and logic and a whole bunch of other stuff together to create computing. And based off of that, we created machine language. And then based off machine language, well, you needed an abstraction for that. That's where we start getting into the world of, I have something that's complex and difficult to work with. What if I create an abstraction on top of that complex thing that makes it simpler for people to use? What's another abstraction that people are really familiar with? DNS is a great abstraction. Everything comes down to IP addresses when you're working with the web. Now, it could be IPv4 or IPv6. Now, if it's IPv4, you have a decent chance of remembering an IPv4 address, but you're not going to remember the address for every website you ever want to go to, and those addresses change over time. They're not easy to remember, they're not easy to type out. So what did we do? We created an abstraction. And the abstraction not only made it easier for you to remember things like nedinthecloud.com, you don't need to know the IP address of that, you just type that into a browser and the abstraction layer takes care of that for you. It also made it more flexible. So if my website ever moves to a different IP address or a different provider, I update the DNS record and suddenly you can get to the website. So abstractions are very useful because they can make the underlying systems more flexible, and they also make it easier for humans to interact with. So you have a complex solution and you've added an abstraction to simplify it for people to interact with, human beings to interact with. Sometimes computers use abstractions too. Okay, so what makes an abstraction good? I think I've covered that a little bit. It's simple to understand to a human, and I would say that A good abstraction covers something like 80+% of use cases for the underlying system. I don't want to interact directly with that system, but I do want to use this abstraction to interact with that system. Okay, I need to cover 80% of my use cases, and that makes a pretty good abstraction if you can do that. You should still have access to the underlying complexity beyond that abstraction. In my case of the IP addresses, I can still directly use IP addresses. I don't need to use DNS. It's just that DNS makes my life easier. If there is a use case where DNS is not helpful, let's say DHCP, for example, where you need to know the IP address of your DHCP servers. Otherwise, how do you even get there? Okay, then you do need to use that lower level construct. You can't work with the abstraction, and that's fine. You can also build your own abstraction on that underlying complexity. You're not boxed out from doing that. So if the abstraction that exists doesn't help you, it's either extensible, so it can help you and meet that use case that wasn't covered by the 80%, or you can still interact with that underlying complexity and build your own abstraction for whatever your use case is. All right, so we've kind of established what a good abstraction is. Now, the question that we talked about at the very beginning is Kubernetes too complex? And I think that's actually the wrong question. I think Kubernetes needs to be as complex as it is to do the work it needs to do properly. Whether it's too complex is more a question of, is it trying to do too much? And I would answer generally no. I think Kubernetes is actually pretty focused on doing a few things and doing them well. Is the abstraction layer good enough? Is really the question we should be asking ourselves. Can you interact with Kubernetes in a way that is simple to understand to humans? And I would say broadly, the answer is no. Developers might be okay with it and writing a lot of YAML, and administrators might be okay going into the command line and punching out kubectl commands to their heart's content. But I would say for the average person, it's not something that is simple and easy to use. So I would say the abstraction layer for Kubernetes needs some work. Now, we've been here before. A good example is probably virtualization. Now, virtualization has been around for a long, long time, long before VMware came out. Virtualization existed in previous operating systems, especially on mainframes. Mainframes were all about dividing up jobs into these discrete units and sandboxing users into their own sort of playground. And as systems moved forward, you had things in Solaris that did this sort of thing. I think they were called jails or something. So the concept has been there for a long time. Virtualization really got the bump up when ESX came along and made it a little bit easier to create virtual machines and created them as like a first-person construct and created that type 1 hypervisor, which was kind of missing before. Now, ESX and ESXi do a lot under the covers, and so does vCenter. Those are actually incredibly complex products. They have to deal with a ton of stuff, from networking to dealing with storage to doing stuff like vMotion of VMs across from one host to another. That is not a simple process. That's very complex. And I don't ask, is vCenter too complex? Because what VMware did, and something they really nailed, was the simplicity of using vCenter. vCenter is very easy to use. It's very easy to interact with. Part of it is the fact that there's a UI involved. Yes, there's PowerShell. Yes, there's command line, but the primary way that most administrators interacted with vCenter was through that UI. And because of that, it made it very digestible and simple to use on the front end. And it matched that 80, or I would even say 90% of use cases could all be done through the UI. Now, if you did need to get into the guts of the system, there were absolutely tools out there that would allow you to get into the guts of vCenter or down into the command line for your ESX. There was the service console. And then when ESXi came along, instead there was CTL commands where you would SSH in and run these commands. So you still had access to the hypervisor and some of the lower level constructs if you had a very specific use case. But the majority of the time, you were living in that UI and consuming it in that way. And I think it's an experience that VMware nailed. They just absolutely had that down pat, and it allowed them to take over Well, pretty much most of the virtualization market. Maybe we'll say 80%. I mean, the rest of it's KVM and Hyper-V, I suppose. That's changed a little bit now that the cloud providers have come in, and AWS uses KVM and their own custom hypervisor, and Azure uses Hyper-V. So that's shifted the equation a bit. But still, VMware in the private data center is kind of king. Kate's needs to resolve similar issues in that simplified manner, but they do have a problem. And the problem is the VMware approach was one vendor determining all of the design decisions. So you got a very cohesive experience in the UI, and all aspects of that experience were tightly coupled with each other. It's the same way that an Apple device feels much more tightly coupled to the applications and software because Apple owns the whole stack. Android feels a little loosey-goosey because Google doesn't own the whole stack. In a similar way, Kubernetes is only one piece of a larger orchestration and container management ecosystem, and it has to interact with all those different parts. And it's open source, so anybody can contribute to it. And because of that, it doesn't feel as tightly coupled and cohesive, and it's harder to build that really slick abstraction layer. Will we get there? I think we will. And the reason why is because it's in the best interest of cloud providers, both in the public cloud and in the private cloud. So you have OpenShift, which is moving towards being that easily consumable UI. And then you have all of the container and Kubernetes as a service offerings from the public clouds, which are making their way onto an on-premises environment with things like Anthos, with things like Azure Arc, with things like AWS Outposts. Those are all options that you can have a managed Kubernetes environment down in your data center that matches your experience in the public cloud. I think that's the future. Kubernetes will continue to be developed in the open, and then the abstraction layers that simplify the management and make it easily consumable are going to come from other vendors while they still contribute back up to the upstream Kubernetes distribution. So, in a nutshell, is Kubernetes complex? Yes. Is it too complex? I don't think so. I think it's all right. And as we build better abstractions, that complexity will be further and further away from our day-to-day experience. So those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you disagree? Am I just talking crazy? I don't know. Love to hear from you. Ned1313 on Twitter, or leave a comment in the YouTube channel. Until tomorrow, where we do Thursdays on the Edge, stay healthy and stay safe, everybody. Thanks.